And the book of Genesis says this about Abraham, the elder and father of many nations. And he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. Here is the father of the lineage that would lead us to Jesus, consuming three products of bovine or cow origin: the butter, the milk, and the calf. Now, is this an isolated verse, or is there more that we can learn from Genesis and Exodus about meat and animal product consumption? In no way do I pretend to be a theologian, but on my recent round through the Bible, I've been noting verses that provide insight into the morality of meat consumption. I think the first two books of the Bible give interesting insight. Being a respecter of God and a health-focused rancher, this topic interests me. And for those that read scripture but struggle with meat consumption, this video will give clarity. Make sure you stay for the full video because I'm going to debunk some of the common misunderstandings associated with biblical food consumption principles. Now, to begin our conversation today, let's get wild. And by wild, I mean venison. I want to start us off by looking at the question of not just specifically looking at eating meats like beef and lamb, but I want to just look at consuming meat in general. And so to do that, we'll step outside of the common things that you're going to go to the grocery store and find. Now, as I begin this conversation with venison, I want to go into the scripture immediately, into the book of Genesis here, and we're going to look at Isaac speaking directly to Esau. And what you'll notice here is that Isaac is sending Esau directly out to harvest venison. And this is what Genesis chapter 27 says. Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy weapons, thy quiver, and thy bow, and go out to the field and take me some venison. Here is Isaac giving Esau direct orders, if you will, to go out and to harvest meat. That is specifically what he is requesting of his son. And I want to keep in context here too that we're still in the lineage of Abraham here. And so these are individuals that are very much in touch with God. They're very much trying to live by God's rules, if you will. I'm hesitating on using the word law, and you'll see why, because I'm going to come back to that later as it relates to biblical law. But we can see that Isaac has specifically said, harvest meat. Go out and take a wild animal, take venison, and bring that back so we may consume that. But this is wild, so I think this begins to already give us direction into, is meat consumption appropriate? But this is by no means the only thing that we should lean on. What I want to share with you is the continuation of this same story. Many of you will recognize this story in that the confrontation between Esau and Jacob, and Rebekah taking sides here, Jacob and Esau's mother. And Rebekah goes on to speak to Jacob, and in so doing, she says to him, still in chapter 27 of Genesis here, she says, go now to the flock and fetch me from thence 2 good kids of the goats, and I will make them savory meat for thy father, such as he loveth. Now, when you look at this verse begins to speak a lot to the habits of the people of this time, especially as we're talking about Isaac's family here. There's some things that I would recommend that we take away from this. When Rebekah is speaking to Jacob, she is directly telling Jacob to go out and to pull animals out of a flock. So clearly they had an easily accessible flock that they could go to harvest these animals from. And there's also the acknowledgement that these are just readily available. Like, this is part of their routine to have these animals around. When you really think into the logistics of what would be taking place in and around this verse. So that's the first thing. The next thing that is noteworthy here is that she tells him, go out and select 2 good kids. Not just any 2 animals in the flock. Be selective. So for him to be selective, there had to be numerous animals out there that they would look at as keeping in a flock. And so if you're keeping that large of a flock, especially of smaller animals like that, you're using those animals for meat. That's their sustenance to you. That's really the main reason you're keeping them. They're not being used for other attributes that they have. And I'll speak to this more. You may look at cattle as being used for work. Well, you're not using goats necessarily in the same way that you would use cattle for work. They're just too small. So they're using these for meat consumption. Now, note also that in the animals that we've talked about here, the goats in this verse, these are ruminant animals. Okay, so that's important. I'll come back to that. But she also, and this may be even more so, is that she says, I will make them savory meat for thy father. And so she knows how to prepare this meat. She knows how to cook this meat, which says that she has experience with it. This is not the first time that she's engaged with trying to prepare meat for someone. She knows how to make it savory. She knows how to bring the flavor out of it and make it taste good, right? And so that's not something that someone who has very infrequent interaction with that meat is going to be able to do. There has to be routine interaction there. Now, let's progress the biblical story forward now. And so we're going to move from Genesis 27 up to Genesis 46. And when we get to Genesis 46, now we begin to look at cattle. And so this is really putting this in the context of modern day. But when you look at the cattle, the question becomes, is this something, again, that they were engaging with every day? And here's what Genesis 46:6 says. And they took their cattle and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with them. So they are traveling with their cattle. So that right there says how important those animals are. You're not, if you think about travel during this time, you're only taking what is absolutely necessary. You're not taking what would be considered an alternative or an elective, so to say. I mean, you're taking what you absolutely need. If you don't need it, you're not taking it. And so they're going to Egypt. They're taking their cattle with them. And so when they took their cattle with them, what we can draw from that is that they kept herds. And why were they keeping herds? Well, predominantly you would think that they would have kept these herds for either meat or milk. Now, there would be a third consideration in here, which I alluded to earlier, is that they could be used for work. And because we're talking about cattle and you've got an animal that's big enough that it can actually do some reasonable amount of work, maybe that's a consideration there. But I'm going to go on into chapter 47, and there's some language in chapter 47 that really refutes this idea that these animals were being used for work. Maybe here and there, but that was not their main purpose. And that language goes on to say that there were concerns over the pastures that they were going to graze. And so you would interpret that to mean that if there are concerns over those pastures, if they don't have availability of feed, then they can't keep weight on those animals, and therefore the meat and the milk production declines. And in addition to that, there's also statements about keeping flocks and herds. This goes back to what I mentioned earlier about a small animal. When you think about goats or sheep being small, and we reference those when they're in their collective, in their groups, as flocks. Flocks aren't being used for work. And so this illustrates that the keeping of these animals really did have a purpose and an intention of trying to provide nourishment to the body. Now, also in chapter 47, in verse 17 here, so chapter 47, verse 17, we see that there is the trading of cattle for bread with Joseph. And this is essentially bartering for food resources. And if you clearly look at bread and say in biblical times, that was a commonly consumed substance. And then if you look at what would have equal value to that, well, if they were bartering with cattle, then that also means that cattle was providing an equal value related to that bread. And so not just in terms of a monetary value, but also in regards to the value that it gave to life in terms of human life. So it provided sustenance for them. So here we can see that there's also the marketing, in a way, if you will, of that food source for, in this case, the Israelites that are in Egypt at this time. Now, that's all still in the first book of the Bible. And so if you look at this and you think this information is really starting to impact the way that I'm thinking about my meat consumption, or just meat consumption in general. Well, if that's the case, share your thoughts with me down in the comments. I'd like to hear where you're at with this and what your perspective is on meat consumption as it relates to biblical principles, especially now that we're looking at some specific examples and ones that aren't often cited. But we've only talked Genesis, and now it's time to move forward into Exodus. And that's going to take us on into other animal products, specifically milk and honey. Now, many times we've heard these verses that reference the land of milk and honey. And specifically, this is when we're beginning to talk about the Israelites as they're on their exodus out of Egypt. And so I'll start us off here with Exodus chapter 3, verses 8, 17 are really good verses to reference here. And you'll see one of these, it says, And I come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. This is highlighting what the value was to the people. The Lord is moving them to a land of milk and honey, so it illustrates just how valuable those substances are. Because think through this now. As they go into that land is able to provide a green, lush environment to be able to feed the cattle, to be able to feed the goats and the sheep. These are all animals that can supply milk. And so therefore that begins to nourish the Israelites that are moving into that area as well, into the promised land. We also talk about honey. Now, honey, you may debate about whether or not honey is truly an animal product. That's not the purpose of this video. The intent here is just to, let's for argument's sake say that it is, because it is a living organism. Also, when they're in that land, if you've got this lush environment, bees are going to be able to proliferate and flourish more, and they're going to make their byproduct, honey, more readily, and that way it's going to be available for those Israelites. So we can see the importance of milk and honey here in the context of those being animal products to sustain sustenance and nutrition for those Israelites. But that's by no means the only thing that we can take from Exodus. There's actually quite a bit more in Exodus here. And so that takes us into looking at Exodus chapter 12, verses 3 through 11. And I'm going to summarize this. And what this is referencing is the consumption of lamb in a ceremonial observance, in an observance of what the Lord has instructed the Israelites to do. But he says to them, you shall eat flesh. Well, where does this meat come from? Well, it has to come from those animals that we've mentioned. And I also want to highlight this. If you look at the animals we've mentioned so far, the cattle, cows, if you will, the cattle, the sheep, the goats, the venison, these are all ruminant animals. So that speaks to what I'm going to touch on later when we get to the law, but you'll recognize those as all clean animals. But as you look at these throughout the Bible, the point is that the Lord is saying that these are different classes of animals that are all ruminants that can be consumed. So let's continue on with Exodus. As we get into chapter 16, verses 8 and 12, we see, and Moses said, this shall be when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full. For that the Lord heareth your murmurings, which ye murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. I really don't know how you can get any more black and white than what it says in this verse. It specifically says, as Moses is communicating what the Lord has said to him, to in turn communicating that to the Israelites, he says, the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat. Flesh, meat, is what he was giving them to eat. Now, they would have bread in the morning, but they were clearly able to eat meat that was being provided by the Lord there. Now, go on to Exodus chapter 22, verse 31, because this is going to give us insight into the sources of meat. This is where we begin to refine what meat should be consumed. And it's not just any meat. And this is going to be different. Again, this is not directly the clean, unclean starting point that comes up in Leviticus in the law. This is before that. This is a different perspective on what we should be consuming as meat. And up to this point, if you think about and go back through any of the verses that I've shared with you, what you'll note is that there's been proper harvesting of these animals that's been instructed. There's been the appropriate consumption. So for example, I mentioned just a few moments ago about the consumption under observance of what God had instructed the Israelites to do, right? But now we've got a different perspective. And this is what Exodus chapter 22, verse 31 says, "And ye shall be holy men unto me. Neither shall ye eat any flesh that is torn of beast in the fields. Ye shall cast it to the dogs." Now, when you look at this, this is referencing avoiding meat that is not properly harvested. And so just to give you an example on this, and I'll come into some of the specific words here in a minute that are in this verse, but just as an example, you think about two animals maybe that have engaged in a brawl and a fight, and one of those animals was fatally wounded, and you were to come across that animal, you're not to eat that animal. The verse states that should be given to the dogs. Let the scavengers consume that, but you as the human, not the scavenger, are not to consume that. And the wording in this really comes down to the word torn. And if you look up the word torn and tear and look at the origin of this word and then take that back to other verses in the Bible that use that language, what you'll find is that most of the time it's associated with a negative occurrence. And the point here is that when the Lord is using the word torn in this verse, it has a negative application. Don't eat that meat. That is not the meat that you should be consuming. We want to have that positive association with the meat that we consume. Now, a question, again, I want to go back to where I started with you on this, is do you have a morality concern? Is there a concern with the morality of eating meat? And I've given you a lot of examples just in the first two books of the Bible here, but this is really less of an issue the closer we get to eating meat raised in a natural state. When animals are raised in a non-natural way outside of what God designed, yes, there could be some morality components to that, but that's really on you and the producer, right? You as the consumer have the opportunity to find producers that are raising meat correctly, and then as you consume that meat, you should have no guilt associated with that. And if you're looking for meat that can be raised and held to this standard, you should visit harvesthillsranch.com for regeneratively raised animal-based foods that your family can absolutely trust. You can look in the description for more on that. Now, I want to close this conversation out today with the topic of the laws of the Bible. And this is, if we were to go to the next book of the Bible, Leviticus, that's where we would really dive deep into the law. But I don't want to leave the mark of this conversation being specifically about clean and unclean meats, because that's not the intention here. This is just about whether meat consumption is acceptable. And so I want to stay focused in Genesis and Exodus, but if we need guidance on what to eat for meat, or if the Lord has given us guidance on what to eat for meat in terms of that clean versus unclean, why would you even need to be told what unclean meats are if consuming meat wasn't an option, or if it wasn't something that was okay in the eyes of God. So clearly it is. So that's one point that I wanted to leave you with. The next is that there's also this suggestion that eating plants is a viable option in the Bible. And clearly it is. The Bible does not waver on that. It says it in multiple ways throughout. But one of the things I think you'll often hear is that it's interesting, and this is interesting to me because there's opposing thoughts on this, that when you look at those that focus on consumption of plants and use biblical verses to validate that, there always seems to be the persuasion that meat is not an acceptable food source, that in some way that's going to lead to the detriment of your health and you should avoid meat. But the irony of that is that when you look at the consumption of meat, that those that are okay with the consumption of meat, and as I've done for you today, that can illustrate to you that meat consumption is within God's principles, that there is no reason to suggest that plants couldn't also be a part of the diet as well. So we don't need this either or. You have to only consume plants, or if you're consuming meat, then you're doing something disrespectful in the eyes of God. That's not accurate. That just doesn't follow biblical language. So here's another argument. If the argument's about taking life, then you got to do a deeper dive on the entire Bible, because one of the things that you're going to recognize is that God is not against taking life. He's not for it, and he puts specific constraints on it. But if you look at even what God said to the Israelites as they were going back towards the promised land, and then they started interacting with with the Canaanites and the Amorites and these other tribes, is that the Lord said, don't intermingle with them, and you need to kill them, because they're going to corrupt you. And they didn't do that. They didn't follow God's law, and he punished them. They didn't follow his directives. But God wasn't saying just go out and unmercifully just start taking life. It was specific in the context of there is a valid reason that you're doing this. And as that relates to animals, if you're harvesting those animals specifically for consumption, guys, that's part of life. For something to live, something must die. And if you really think through that, plants, animals, everything in nature follows that criteria. Just really think through the natural cycles of life, and you'll see that that actually is true. But if these animals are being harvested in a disrespectful manner, being tortured in some way, or there's some malice intent associated with them, that's the issue. No one's in favor of that. God doesn't advocate that in any way. So you really have to put this in a bigger context. And some have also stated that there's going to be health problems aligned with the meat consumption. That's a very dogmatic viewpoint, and frankly, it's just inaccurate. You have meat consumption has been taking place for literally centuries upon centuries, and we haven't seen all the chronic diseases that we see in the modern era. So how do you align those two thought processes? They're completely counterintuitive. So the other thing is that this doesn't match basic clinical observation. You have many individuals that have a meat-heavy diet. You even have the carnivore diet community, and these individuals are thriving. So to suggest that meat consumption is destroying health, that's just inaccurate. I mean, I'm not even going to say that's a stretch. That's just wrong. Now, when you look at what really matters in this, it's animal quality. It's the quality of the meat. Where are those animals being raised at? Even if you get into the scientific literature and start looking at the studies around meat consumption, one of the big biases that you'll see is that many of these studies are epidemiological studies. They're looking back. They're not actually following these individuals to the level that it may seem that they are to draw these conclusions. Now, after listening to what I've shared with you here, if you think, okay, you've made some good points in this, I can see where meat consumption is biblically, that is a biblical principle. I can do that and not sin in any way against God. If you're ready to bring back meat into your diet and you think, okay, I got to run down to my local Costco and start bringing in a few products here? Well, before you do that, you're not going to believe what I uncovered on my last visit to Costco that you need to know about. So watch the video here to find out more.